everybody, and my name is Simon Roy. I lead the higher education policy team here at the OECD, and you're all very welcome to this OECD webinar that aims to explore how countries are integrating micro-credentials into their education and training systems as a way to help people acquire new knowledge and skills in a more flexible and way than in traditional learning programs. The webinar today aims to bring together insights from a recently completed micro-credential implementation project, which we undertook here at the OECD, and which analysed the main policy tools that countries are using to promote the development and uptake of micro-credentials. The project was funded by the European Union and we worked with 4 European OECD countries: Finland, the Slovak Republic, Slovenia, and Spain, to understand how they're approaching the question of integrating micro-credentials into their system and to share experiences. So basically, in this webinar, we'll explore the main objectives of micro-credentials and the types of policies that countries are putting in place to promote them and to improve their uptake. We will also look at how and why approaches vary depending on the administrative and educational traditions of different countries. So we have a diverse set of countries in our discussion today. And we'll also look at what countries are planning next and how the systems in the different countries plan to evaluate and measure the effects of these new micro-credential systems that they're trying to build. Before introducing the speakers, we have to discuss the topics today. A word for those joining us live. Please do feel free to get involved. The Zoom chat is open and you can place questions and comments in that chat. We'll try to get to those, to any questions you raise towards the end of this webinar. So for a discussion today, I'm joined by a range of experts from the countries, different countries participating in the project from the European Commission. So firstly, I'm joined by Petri Haltia, who is Senior Ministerial Advisor at the Ministry of Education and Culture in Finland. Hello, Petri. I'm joined by Peter Ondrichka, who is the Director of the Higher Education Department at the Ministry of Education, Science, Research and Sport in the Slovak Republic. Peter, good afternoon.
Hi, everyone.
I'm also joined by Duša Majetic, who is the head of the Higher Education Division in Slovenia's Ministry of Higher Education, Science and Innovation. Duša, good afternoon. I'm joined by Pedro Martínez Martín, who is Senior Ministerial Advisor at the Ministry of Science, Innovation and Universities in Spain, and by Isabel Ladrón Arroyo, who is Policy Officer at the European Commission's Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. Isabel, good day. And Shizuka Kato, finally, my colleague here in the Directorate for Educational Skills at the OECD. So we're going to explore the questions that I mentioned in the introduction, and maybe just to start with a really basic question, Shizuka, what are micro-credentials?
Thank you, Simon, and hello, everyone. So at the OECD, we have a very broad definition. We say micro-credentials, compared to traditional education and training programs such as degree programs, they are smaller in volume, workload, and they are more targeted in terms of content and also the focus of skills. And lastly, they are more flexible in delivery. So they are often offered online or sometimes in hybrid mode.
And you mentioned that they're so smaller, they're more flexible, but many might say, well, these sorts of programs or small programs, flexible programs, those have existed in various forms in systems for years, and we didn't call them micro-credentials. But also, in a way, what makes micro-credentials different, or to what extent can we say they actually are different from more traditional programs for continuous learning?
Yes, I think I've been asked this question 100 times, so that's a question of everybody's. And I'd say, well, so micro-credential, it's difficult to distinguish micro-credentials and also existing continuing education programs really like with a clear border. But I think what's increasingly called as micro-credentials share 4 features. One is that they are more labor market oriented. They are often discussed in the context of upskilling and reskilling. And second is that they are often offered online, as I said, more flexible. So it's more accessible to those working and also those with family responsibilities. And then the third one is the stackability. So before, when we are talking about existing continuing education programs, they were just standalone in many cases. But now when we talk about the micro-credential, then we often talk about stacking it to a longer program. So that's the third point. And then lastly, they are often discussed in a cross-sectoral way. So before, continuous education or like lifelong learning existed, but in different sectors. In higher education, universities talked about it amongst universities, and then the vocational education and training providers talked about it amongst themselves. But now in a micro-credential discussion, all of them are brought together, higher education experts and vet expert, and also adult education providers. So in this way, it's more cross-sectoral, and also with the involvement of employers, micro-credentials involve a range of stakeholders. So these are the 4 features we think micro-credentials could be distinguished from existing programs.
Thanks a lot for that, Shizuka. As we've mentioned, and as is evident here from just from this project, micro-credentials are being developed, and there's policies being developed for micro-credentials across many OECD countries. It has been an initiative in Europe, and particularly within the European Union. And for that reason, I'd like to turn to Isabel, who joins us from the European Commission. The Council of the European Union adopted a recommendation for micro-credentials in 2022, which has really sort of encouraged member states in the European Union to develop systems of micro-credentials and really promote them. Can you say a bit more about why the EU decided to adopt this recommendation, and also, in a way, what does the EU, the Commission, and the member states in adopting the recommendation, what do they hope to achieve through a wider adoption of micro-credentials?
Sure, thank you very much. Well, actually, this initiative of the European approach to micro-credential is part of a broader agenda of the EU, that is the European Skills Agenda, and it's one of the flagship initiatives within this European Year of Skills that is running until May 2024. And basically, the idea is to promote a change of mindset in the population and among workers, and to promote this idea of creating a culture of lifelong learning. That is to say that we do not just take initial education and then go to the world of work and that's it, but that we need, as Shizuka has said, to upskill and reskill all throughout our lives. Actually, there is this EU target by 2030 in which the idea is that at least 60% of adults participate in training every year. So just to give a bit the broader context of this initiative on micro-credentials within the EU skills development policy. And what is the point of this recommendation is very much related to the exponential growth in micro-credentials that have happened in recent years. This has happened on its own, like nothing to do with any, let's say, policy push somehow. But the problem is that sometimes, as it has grown many times out of over the quality and transparency of micro-credentials, and also about how they relate to the standard qualifications systems. So let's say that there was a need to create some sort of order there, of course, letting them be flexible and targeted and labor market oriented as they are, that this is the point of micro-credentials, but at the same time trying to facilitate a bit a common understanding on them. So this is the point of adopting a council recommendation on a European approach to micro-credential. It's let's try to get a common European approach. So actually this council recommendation includes a common definition some standard elements to issue a microcredential and some guiding principles. These are the 3 building blocks of the recommendation. And all in all, the goal of this recommendation is to promote quality, trust, and uptake of microcredentials by making them more comparable and understandable. So let's say, like to say in a very plain way, is like to put some sort of order, or like try to get this common European approach of this world of microcredentials that has exponentially grown in itself.
No, absolutely. That's very clear. And I think we'll come, in fact, with some of our later speakers will also explain how they've been working on that particular issue as well in their national system. So bringing order to an extent in the national system. But just as a sort of a follow-up and about, before we turn to some of our colleagues in the capitals in different parts of Europe, how in a way, so the Commission obviously adopted the Council adopted the recommendation, but how has the Commission afterwards in a way been following up that recommendation and in a way supporting member countries to implement the principles that are set out essentially that member countries have adopted at European level?
Yeah, so I would say in 2 different ways. First of all, like creating a spaces like fora for discussion, because there is a lot still like to agree, to discuss, like to learn on microcredentials. So specifically, we are organizing a series of pre-learning activities. The first one happened late January, like 2 weeks ago. It was on the 29th of January, and we organized it together with CEDEFOP. And there we took a sectoral approach to microcredentials for the first time. So we explore how microcredentials were being used in the manufacturing and retail sector. It was a great success, like almost 200 stakeholders were participating there, and was very fruitful discussion. And there are 2 more pre-learning activities to come. And a bit the idea of these pre-learning activities is that we gather policymakers and like stakeholders who are engaged in this world, and we learn from each other, and we see what are the difficulties and how to overcome them. So that's on the one hand, a little bit encouraging this discussion, and of course, participating and supporting any research in that sense with the OECD, with CEDEFOP, and so. And then like the second part, in which like how the EU is promoting the implementation of the Council recommendation, and in general, like the uptake of microcredentials, is via like allocating funds to there. So specifically now there is open an Erasmus Plus call for policy experimentations, where there is a topic, like topic number 5, that is on microcredentials. There are 2 priorities there. One is creating microcredential ecosystems, and the other one is like working for microcredentials for the green and digital transitions. So also very much in line with the EU main policy priorities. So I would say that this is like the 2 ways in which the EU is trying to support the implementation of the Council recommendation.
Indeed, so a sharing and direct support for the development of microcredentials through the funding instruments that you have at European level. And again, we'll hear also about some of the national ways that those funds are being deployed in a second. Thank you very much, Isabel.
Thanks a lot.
If we then think about some of the points that Isabel raised there in terms of the European approach, but also like said this question again of creating a little bit of order in an area which is emerging, which is developing, which is rapidly evolving. One of the issues that the countries, not just in Europe, have been facing is, in a way, firstly, what is a microcredential in their system? How do they understand it? And also the question of how do microcredentials relate and interact with other types of qualification, for example. So turning now to our colleague Pedro in Madrid. Pedro, we know that this is an issue that the different countries are facing. But my question really here is, I know in Spain that you have adopted a new legislation which has really established the concept of microcredentials for the first time, and that you've taken an approach to really embed microcredentials in your formal legal framework. Could you tell us a little bit more about what was done in Spain and how you defined microcredentials in the legislation?
Thank you. First of all, as Isabel said before, we have to highlight the 2022 Council recommendation about the EU approach of microcredential. that, as you know, it encourages a member state to adopt an European approach to micro-credentialing, in particular to apply a common EU definition of micro-credential. The aim of this recommendation was that in micro-credential definition, all countries and stakeholders trying to develop and use a micro-credential in a current way. So this was the guideline for the definition given to micro-credential in Spain. However, at the beginning of setting in motion this recommendation, we found, let me say, several challenges. So it was necessary to provide a more open approach that could accommodate the initiatives already developed by university and other actors. In Spain, we found that the best way to conceptualize micro-credential would be through a legal framework that could be developed over time and the development of other policies related with. This way, in Spain, we focus our definition on, let me say, three main topics. One could be format, second one could be the content, and the third one could be the objective audience. Regarding with the format, it was necessary to define it as a brief, less than 15 ECTS, formal, flexible, portable, that can be carried in the form of a certificate or individual account, stackable to be able to incorporate into other higher studies, and recognizable through the national and community territory. If we are speaking about the content of the micro-credential, it must be current, based on the new needs that arise, and designing from the point of view of demand. The new needs arising from the labor market. And finally, regarding with the target, it's main that the objective audience must meet or the micro-credential, must meet the requirements of being focused on people, workers or unemployed people, aged between 25 and 64 years. Anyway, it's crucial to keep in mind that probably various universities of your countries have already begun to design and implement their own offer of micro-credential. So our advice is to provide legislation, but with certain margins of flexibility that can be developed in more details in the future. That's in order to avoid future problems of coherence with already courses or policies that are ongoing.
Right. So that's indeed very clear, and point taken there about allowing flexibility, which is often a point we would anyway make about legislation, of course, because it's once you've made it, it's quite hard to change it. But in the end, Spain did take the approach of adopting legislation and putting this really into law, so into decrees and into law. And that's a particular choice. We do see in other OECD countries, for example, say in Australia, where they're also developing micro-credentials, they've adopted more some guidelines at the national level, but they haven't necessarily put it in law. Do you have any sort of reflections on why in the Spanish context, why in Spain you chose this essentially to put it into legislation?
Okay, you have the point. First of all, it's necessary to put in context that Spain has been working on a definition of micro-credential since 2020, and since then, an intense dialogue has been carried out with the stakeholders involved, with the aim of establish a common but flexible definition in the concept of a micro-credential, but without introducing inappropriate constriction, let me say strong limits, for an instrument that, as you know, nowadays is in an incipient or a starting stage. So the key is trying to guide, but not restricting the capacity of university and other stakeholders to adapt this instrument to their own strategy and priorities. So the main benefit of having a legal framework for us is that it affects other social policies such as the asylum rights, foreigners who come for studies, employment, or financial policies. So let me say one example. the EU directive relating to the entry and residence requirements for foreigners, national of third countries for the purpose of research, studies, internships, volunteering, study exchange program, or educational projects. A result of this of the transposition of this directive here in Spain, we develop a royal decree that allows a residence permit for people who comes to learning courses of upskilling or reskilling competence. And of course, that includes micro-credentials. Furthermore, in the particular case of Spain, as a consequence of Spain's intense cooperation in education with Ibero-American countries and with the different community partners in the form of European alliances, so many different initiatives were beginning to appear under the name of university micro-credentials. So this began to disturb the EU recommendation and the EU approach about micro-credential. So in conclusion, we consider that it's necessary to regulate and conceptualize micro-credential, but on the other hand, let me say, it is necessary to take in account for the definition to be flexible enough, trying to avoid, as I said before, coherence problems with other policies underdeveloped or with micro-credentials initiatives that are already underway.
Okay, right. That's very clear. Thank you. If we move perhaps to another, so in a sense, Pedro has been talking about creating the legal and the administrative space for micro-credential setting in place and definition, so we know what we're talking and talking a common language. There's obviously many other aspects to the development of these types of program, and one of them is the question of quality and how you try and engage and assure a certain level of quality in what's being provided. So turning to Peter now, when countries are trying to pin down what micro-credentials are and the providers start offering them, there is this sort of question about, well, what is what is being offered actually relevant, of good quality? Is it going to be of use to the learners who take part of it in that? And then there's a question of kind of who's responsible for checking that, who's responsible for the assurance of certain standards and qualities. And many OECD countries are really trying to find the right balance at the moment between, on one hand, having those guarantees around quality and the relevance of what's being provided, and also the inherent nature of micro-credentials, that they should be flexible. We can create new ones quickly to respond to changing skill needs and so on. So Peter, what's the approach that's being taken or being planned in the Slovak Republic in this area? Because I know you're working on this.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for this question, because I think it's a huge topic and it was discussed on many platforms before. Well, we had some plans, but because of the changes in the government, I'm still talking about the plans because the implementation will follow in the next few months and years. But let's say we have some options and discuss them. So the first thing, from the perspective of higher education, we moved from the single accreditation of single study programs to the institutional accreditation, which means that all our higher education institutions as a traditional providers have an internal quality assurance system. And during the discussions last 2 or 3 years, when we were thinking about the quality assurance of micro-credentials, mostly the experts suggested that try to use the tools we already have and don't create new tools if they are not necessary for the micro-credentials. And we have quality assurance systems at the level of higher education institutions, and from our perspective, it could be maybe used to cover micro-credentials. We have a Quality Assurance Act, which established our new Quality Assurance Agency. There are some regulations for the accreditation standards, and we have body to cover the external quality assurance processes. So there is some environment for quality assurance already existing at the level of higher education institutions. And from our perspective, or what is our plan is to use these tools, maybe modify the Quality Assurance Act, then the standards, and to cover the micro-credentials at the level of higher education institutions as a providers. Well, the problem is then when we talk about the alternative providers, because there is still a lot of questions which need to be solved. But from our perspective, there is not really good idea to use the single certificate or the single program accreditation, because the micro-credentials should be smaller, should be more flexible. And if we put every course in the process of accreditation, which could take a long time, it will be very hard to make a flexible system, pardon, which will be really motivating the institutions to participate and even the learners really to go for it. Because if you need the course and you have to wait for it a long time, it will be very hard to create a functional system. But the quality assurance is important for the motivation of each stakeholder, each participant, because without the quality, it will be harder to make recognition of the outcomes of the process of education. So it will be really difficult to really say why I need such course.
Yeah. I mean, you make the point there about using obviously existing tools, and also, for example, when higher education institutions are the provider, one can see quite clearly how maybe an institutional quality mechanism might help to guarantee quality in the micro-credentials they provide. But you mentioned also alternative providers and this question about, so when you have whether they're provided by associations, whether private companies or whoever's providing these kind of small units of learning in whatever field, what about that sort of space? Because in a way there's in a sense a greater risk there that you have a diversity of quality in a way.
So we have like two options or two plans which were already discussed. I mean, in the internal processes within the ministry. The first thing is or the first plan is when we are not sure about the quality assurance levels at the alternative providers, maybe then think about some kind of participation between the higher education institutions and alternative providers when the alternative provider is maybe a private company which is more competent to provide the course, but has no quality assurance system policies. Maybe some connection or some cooperation with the university could be really helpful for both the participants. So the process of quality assurance will be used, of the university will be used for the courses of the private company to issue really certificate which is provided with the knowledge of the company, but covered by the policies of the university. This is one potential solution. The other one is to create like two separate modules or models of micro-credentials, which we called, one is micro-credential and one is micro-qualification in our language. And the micro-credential will be not such regulated course, which means it will be flexible. It will be provided without quality assurance, but it will be harder to recognize it in the process of at the labor market. Then the micro-qualification will be provided only by the providers which have quality assurance policies. And there will be really clear that these courses and certificates are results of some established regulated processes. So those courses will be not so flexible maybe, but they'll be more trustful. That's the question. But because of the changes in the government and other discussions we started in the January, this is not solved yet, which way we will take. But we have a new project, I mean, within the ministry with the internal and external working group, and we are discussing this also with the stakeholders like the Quality Assurance Agency to really solve the questions in the details and set up really the way.
No, that's clearly that's interesting. I mean, it's also clearly something I think quite a lot of countries haven't entirely cracked that particular challenge at the moment. So moving on though, just thinking about some other of the sort of way or elements that we need to think about in designing policy for micro-credentials. Dusha, obviously funding is a really important aspect, and in particular we see examples from quite a number of OECD countries where government has kind of provided at least some money for providers to start developing micro-credentials. And I actually know that is something you've been doing in Slovenia. Could you tell us a little bit about the sort of way, your approach you've been taking to funding the development or the provision of these new types of programs, short programs, small programs?
I apologize. Thank you for the invitation. And of course, yes, we are actually using the European Resilience and Recovery mechanisms to reform Slovene higher education. It's an overarching reform, but as part of this reform, we are also focusing on micro-credentials. So we are basically funding higher education institutions to set up their institutional, let's use the word, ecosystems for micro-credentials. So we've been, since 2022, these pilot projects are running, and we are funding a variety of pilot projects. So basically, it's good to know that in Slovenia, we haven't yet officially implemented micro-credentials. And for this reason, we gave our higher education institutions a very broad framework in which we are expecting them to build up their institutional systems for micro-credentials. And then we will take up from there and also see how we can incorporate this into the national education system and even broader on the EU level. So we are covering, if that's of interest, all costs. Especially we see the costs of equipment is very important because they have to adjust the way they are delivering their education in terms of higher education institutions. When we did the last monitoring, we sort of counted that these pilot projects include about 80 micro-credentials that we expect that they will be delivered in the next 2 years.
Could you just maybe give it, I mean, what would be some examples of, just very quickly, I mean, so a few examples of types of program that, or of micro-credentials that you see being offered in, or just to give people a flavor?
Well, currently our monitoring did focus on the way micro-credentials are used to deliver competencies in the green transition. So we have quite some inspiring examples there. Maybe I can, from the University of Ljubljana, of Primorska, sorry, we see that they are using the new European Bauhaus Academy Pioneer Hub for Sustainable Built Environments with Renewable Materials, so the NEB Academy, to sort of establish a network of international network of higher education institutions to prepare competences in the field of built environment. For this, why the example is inspiring is because they are actually using the legacy of existing knowledge created by the InnoRenew Center of Excellence, and they are very ambitious, trying to incorporate all the European Union's goal with the new Bauhaus initiative. Maybe another example, which is just to show how niche knowledge is being incorporated in micro-credentials, comes from the University of Ljubljana. They are focusing, for example, on education in sustainable water management and precision livestock farming through the introduction of real-time sensing technologies, which is very interesting to monitor. Exactly.
Yeah.
And just one more example, which is, and then I will stop. It's for me as a policymaker, I find very interesting example from the University of Maribor. They are actually preparing a micro-credentials to teach academia on digital and sustainable skills. And this is part of a pilot project that aims to teach students through hidden curriculum. So that's an interesting thing to follow up.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, it is useful to sort of try and think, because indeed many sort of applications for different fields. Just one very final question very quickly, if you would. I mean, we're talking as in Slovenia, but also elsewhere, lots of pilot projects funding the initial startup. Is there any thinking already about sort of the longer term way micro-credentials would be funded, or is it almost too early to do that?
All of that, actually, that's the most frequent questions we got from our universities, how the micro-credentials are going to be funded after the pilot projects. And actually, we expect the pilot projects, so the piloting of micro-credentials, to give some insights in what the good model would be. Maybe just to share with the audience that Slovenia is one of the countries that predominantly higher education is funded from public funds. So we do not have a tradition when people are used to fund their higher education. And I think that's like a prerequisite if you want to build a system that will be, let's say, funded from different sources. What we can see is actually what one of the dangers is that if we keep the present model just funded from the public funds to the higher education institutions, we are afraid that the system won't be efficient. Efficient for us would actually an efficient system for us would be that universities are producing micro-credentials on stock basis with unknown users, so that these micro-credentials are not current. Basically, what we are thinking about is for the first time to combine different resources, so public funds, private funds, but there are more questions than answers at the moment. For example, when we are talking about how to provide public funds, are these funds going to go to the higher education institutions? Are they going to go to the learners? Are they going to go to institutions for a known learner? So there's still quite a lot of questions to be resolved, but hopefully by 2025, when the pilot projects end, also the funding system is going to be in place.
Very good. Petri, turning to you in Finland, I know that so Finland has also, like in Slovenia, also introduced or it has a pilot project for micro-credentials. So could you perhaps tell us a little bit about that very briefly, and also one of the key things that we'll come on to is, in a sense, how do we judge whether this is a success in a way? Because when we have a pilot for anything, we typically want to know afterwards, well, what was it? What do we learn from that? And how are you going about that in Finland?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we really have just made a decision that the Service Center for Continuous Learning and Employment in Finland can open a procurement call for micro-credential pilots this spring. And the background for this is that with the working group, we have prepared guidelines or a framework for micro-credentials. And this framework, which is still to be fine-tuned before the pilot start, is based on the European Union Council recommendation and the standard elements to describe micro-credentials presented in it. And these elements are recommended as a resource to support implementation. And that is the aim of our national framework too, to support implementation in all phases, anticipating competence needs, planning the micros in industry, education, cooperation, and realizing the micro-credentials. And like we already heard today, micro-credentials are not really a new thing, not in any country, I guess. But our aim is to promote micro-credentials as a coherent, identifiable, reliable, an appreciated way of acquiring and validating competence. And although our framework is based on the EU recommendation, it goes further in giving guidance on some of the elements, for instance, the way to describe learning outcomes and assessment. And it has prepared especially higher education in mind, but it will be possible to apply it in other education and training too. And now the purpose is really to test the framework and also to develop cooperation between education providers and working life, which is necessary in its implementation. So in short, what we want to achieve at least is information on how the framework works in practice and whether it brings added value, and if not, then why, and how it should be perhaps developed. And also we want to achieve permanent cooperation models with which to target, plan, and realize the micro-credentials. But of course, these aims and criteria will be made more accurate when the call is prepared by the Service Center together with our ministry and our working group. So this is in short.
It's fair then just to summarize a little bit on that last point around the monitoring impact that's still a work in progress to some extent in terms of working out exactly how to do that.
Yeah, of course, it is still very much in progress. So we have to more clearly define the criteria, what we are expecting. But anyway, the idea is to test the framework and whether it kind of enhances the quality of micro-credential is in a very general way.
Right. Yeah, no, understood. So finally, just on this, but a point where Finland is also, I know, working is, and a question that arises frequently in the question of micro-credentials, because there's also an expansion of the number of offerings available, is the information available to learners. Could you just sort of, and sort of like how learners can be guided towards learning opportunities that correspond to what they need? Can you just say very briefly a little bit about what Finland's been doing in that space, in the sense of the information question?
Yeah, this is very much also work in progress, but we already have in operation a study info website, Opintopolku in Finnish, with all the information about study programs leading to a degree in Finland and the possibility to apply online. Still under development, there are two portals that will be very important regarding micro-credentials. The service bundle for continuous learning, which will serve the whole field of continuous learning, and DigiVision 2030, a joint program of all Finnish higher education institutions. And both will serve learners in many ways. Through digital services for continuous learning, individuals can examine and compare educational and career choices and make plans and decisions on them. The service will enable individuals to identify and verbalize their competence, skills, and interests, and create their own competence profile, which is very interesting and important. They will also be able to compare the situation and prerequisites to the possibilities for competence development on offer and the opportunities in the labor market. And likewise, the employers can find information on possibilities to develop their personnel and about the labor market situation. And the DigiVision will too have the possibilities for comparison and will provide guidance covering higher education. And although it may seem that we are developing two overlapping portals, I can say that there is on the one hand cooperation and on the other some differences, but of which I am not really the right person to tell in detail. But what is also a quite ambitious goal in these portals, especially the service bundle for continuous learning, is that it would provide information not only about what is available, but also information about what is not available, but should be. Meaning that the portal would also gather information if the users, whether they are learners or employers, search for something but cannot find it. So this is, of course, would be very useful and important data for education providers.
Yeah.
This is, like I said, all still yet to come.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, understood. Let's just very quickly, as we sort of draw some of this to a close, but consider just two further points I think are particularly important, and one of those is this question around whether micro-credentials are actually responding to particular needs in the labor market. And maybe to Duja, I was wondering if you could maybe just reflect slightly on how you've been going about or the approach to doing this, in the sense how you when you have providers developing what their provision, to try and steer as a policymaker or as a government, how do you sort of try and steer what's being developed so that it somehow does align with what's required in the labor market? What are the kind of tools you can use?
Again, a very complex and good question. It's actually, we are we provided the funding and the framework to higher education institutions to find a way and connect with the, let's say, with the labor market, with the employers. Basically, we know that's not the strength of our higher education system, but we see micro-credentials as the mechanisms to enable higher education institutions basically to respond to labor market needs for short and medium-term higher education competences. So I have to emphasize everything. For example, to say it in the way I see it, that micro-credentials are like a mechanism for fine-tuning of the competences of graduates for a specific or even niche needs of the labor market and the employers, which we are not able to provide. So this knowledge is not able to be provided through the formal education within the 3 or 2 years study programs. Maybe just to participants, if I may, to understand the context in which I'm speaking, is it's not our strength to predict labor market needs, and we are still thinking about occupations, not competences. And we know it's very clear today that except for the regulated occupations, you do not have one-on-one study program with the occupation. And here we see the micro-credentials coming in and, let's say, building a bridge between the lack of knowledge, of specific knowledge from the graduate and the needs from the employers.
Okay. Yeah, no, clearly, I mean, an area we're all working on, I guess, but yeah, interesting to hear that. Just the other point I wanted to raise, which is often discussed, is this sort of accessibility, access, the potential of micro-credentials to widen access to learning to a larger number. We know this is actually quite a challenge in especially when you're dealing with adult populations, that basically those who try and engage in learning, or those that do engage in learning, typically are those who are already quite well educated. So there's always a challenge in that area. I just wanted to turn to Pedro, because I know that has been a concern in the design of some of the activities in Spain, and I know that I think you have been or there have been measures taken, should we say, to try and widen access in the Spanish context.
Okay, yes, we introduced a kind, well, let me say, when we assign funds to the autonomous communities, that for people is a kind of administration with a low level, we sign an agreement to distribute these funds, but establish that people who are unemployed or at risk of exclusion can take this training also for free. These measures are, of course, additional with another kind of scholarships and grants, and this is additional and, of course, compatible. But on the other hand, let me say, and with the aim of promoting the access of people with fewer resources, in the definition, the format definition of the micro-credentials, it must be open and adapted to the needs and particularities of the students. In this way, it is to allow to be a physical, virtual, or mixed type of teaching as people want. With this measure, we aim to ensure that any student from any region, even if they are disadvantaged, can have access to this kind of training. So it is needed to take into account that diverse places, contexts, and cultures, physical, online, blend, virtual, or digital, in which people want to learn.
Okay, yeah, that's certainly an interesting approach, and I think also it's another one of these questions, this sort of accessibility and who's participating in these micro-credentials, that is also on the agenda across our countries, and something we should definitely follow up together on how that's working. Just finally, Shizuka, do you want to come in on this question that's been raised quite a lot in the chat, which is around sort of measuring? We already mentioned it with Pedro, but is around measuring sort of the impact of and the sort of factors. How do we say that micro-credentials are successful? What sort of longer term impact might they have? Because obviously micro-credentials are quite small, so in comparison to something like a bachelor's degree, it's much harder to attribute causality and so on. So what's your reflection on that? Very, very difficult question.
Yes, I know you're asking a difficult question, but yes, as you said, like it's Also, like for traditional education training programs, we are still working on measuring their impacts. Like we are working on graduate tracking and so on. So I won't have a definite answer for sure, but quite a few efforts are underway across OECD countries and also outside. And in many cases, the evaluation of impact is done through the evaluation of pilot initiatives, as we already discussed. And in these cases, our surveys are used, and then the surveys amongst participants, and then we compare changes in employment and also income, and as well as a change of fields of specialization. So whether participants have moved from low demand skills area or the occupation to high demand occupation. So these are the things are often measured in surveys. And also sometimes indicators like as the indicators of success, we look at completion rates, of course, because these programs are often offered online amongst non-traditional students, meaning that the working adults, so they are busier and it's online. So often completion rates are lower than longer programs amongst full-time students. So in this sense, completion rate is also another indicator. And then, but the problem, a few countries are also moving on to the next step of using administrative data, linking administrative data, because we have problems or challenge with survey data of them being self-reported, and also we have a problem of a response rate. So in the US and in Singapore, they are working on it already. And I can tell you the example of the US, they are measuring the impact of industrial certifications by using data from different data sets, like data from certification bodies, and then educational attainment, and then enrollment data from post-secondary education institutions, and also aggregated data from Census Bureau on like income and employment rate. So these are the efforts made in OECD countries. We are working on it.
Absolutely, but I guess our job as the OECD is constantly to say, please, to everyone, do try and make an effort to monitor the effects of what we're doing and what we're supporting through policy, because otherwise we never know whether it's working, and we never know how we can improve it. So, but the message from Shizuka there, really, like we at the moment, we need, with these quite difficult to measure outcomes, it's a question of trying to combine testing and combining multiple sources where we can. I'm going to close and bring the webinar to a close now, just with really a final question to as many people as we can fit in the time that we have left, which is with asking for a very short answer, but it's just sort of like, in your system or in your at European level, what do you see as the kind of the next steps for micro-credentials? We've heard a lot about pilot projects, about testing approaches, developing capacity to deliver these, creating new legal frameworks. Where do we go next in a sense? Perhaps Isa first.
Well, there are so many aspects, right? But like, just to comment, one that we are trying to explore also on our pre-learning activities, and so is like trying to tap or to explore further the potential of micro-credentials for social inclusion. It has been already touched upon, like during this discussion. But actually, like, there is two ways in which that can happen, as we have discussed it lately. Like, first of all, because as it was very rightly said, like, micro-credentials are by definition flexible, so they can be adapted to the needs of the learners. And that's a huge potential that normally, like, some education systems are a barrier in themselves for accessibility for so many different type of learners. So in that sense, like, micro-credentials have this potential, like, to enable access to education and lifelong learning and upskilling and reskilling to groups of learners that traditionally are way farther than there. And secondly, like, the second aspect, how micro-credentials can also be a boost for motivation and for social inclusion, is because in the end, they are a sort of recognition by society, if you want, right? Like, we fall somehow, like, at some point receive a title or like any sort of like accreditation by the system that acknowledge your worth and your skills and who you are. But there are, for so many people, that this is the definition also of like a socially exclude, right? where this has never done, and a micro-credential can be a first step to get like in this small bill, like this recognition by the system of like you have this skill, you have this competence, you're able to do this, and someone else acknowledge it somewhere else when you own your micro-credential. So on my side, like just to mention this part of the potential of micro-credentials for social inclusion, there is a lot to do there.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Peter, do you have anything to add and sort of where in the Slovak system, what next?
Well, we were very good in planning, so we did it like for a few years. So it's time to adopt at least something and really implement the reforms. So for our pragmatic vision, it's like to really implement what we already planned. So adopt the legislation, then publish the calls to support really creation of micro-credentials at different providers. We also have some projects, internal, to think how to use micro-credentials in specific sectors. Like right now we're discussing how to motivate people to work in civil services and really focus the civil service not on the diplomas, but on the qualifications to really be able to work for the government, for the country. Also maybe to try to think about the teachers' education and healthcare qualifications to boost the motivation to work really in these sectors. So those are the next steps for us, and we will see how to really include the alternative providers and create the whole environment. But I think we will take step by step and really don't do it like everything in general in one moment.
Okay, very clear. Good luck. Petri, finally to you, perhaps just some final reflection on what next for Finland.
Yeah, well, I think I already told about our next steps quite a lot, but I would say that now that we have done this preparatory work, our next step is to strengthen the concept of micro-credentials, and that is what we are trying to do with the pilots, and then of course after the pilots with the results that we achieve from the pilot. So this is how we'll proceed.
Very good. Listen, everyone, thank you very much for taking part today, everyone for joining us online. We hopefully, I think, in looking at the questions we received in the chat, we kind of tried to address a lot of those only, of course, very briefly in the hour we had, but we did at least try and tackle some of those. And I think what we're leaving with there is sort of a lot of work ongoing, a lot of opportunities to take stock in the future on what we've learned from these different experiences in the different countries, both within the EU and of course more broadly in the OECD. And so with that, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, and I would like to thank everyone online and wish you a very pleasant afternoon or other part of the day wherever you are in the world. Thank you.